Natalie to tell us why Greens in government is such a good idea.
And one of the things that, having been on Question Time twice now, I've come to recognise is that Labor and Tory, and when they have someone who's a non-party person, will always get their fair share. But as a Green, you have to fight to get in there, and that's the only way you get your space. And that perhaps is a metaphor for the whole campaign. What you're all doing here on the ground is we have to get out there and fight for our space, really show that we're here and making a difference. I'm going to talk a bit about what elected councillors up and down the country have really achieved, have made a difference with. And before I start, I will just have to note that one thing you might see with playing Caroline's broadcast up there, I think this is probably a very unusual political meeting. It's a political meeting being addressed by 3 women. And that's not something that you see very often. It's usually, we have a token male, so we're but usually it's swapped the other way around. So it's I think it's very nice to see it. I did see some references to, Greens being different, and that's one of the ways in which we are different. But being very serious about Greens in government, there's only one place in the country where we have something that you could say that looks like Greens in government, and that of course is in Brighton and Hove, the first Green council in the country. Now, it's really tough because it's a minority administration, which means they can't just decide to do things. And indeed, some of the things that they've tried very hard to get through, like a rise in council tax that would have basically allowed them 2 years ago to set a no-cuts budget, they couldn't get it through because Labor joined with the Tories to knock it down. But despite all the difficulties, when you start to look at the list of what the Greens have achieved in Brighton and Hove, it's really a damn impressive list. One of the nice things that Caroline referred to in the broadcast was making it a living wage council. Despite everything, all the difficulties, all of the cuts coming from central government, they ensure that everyone working for the council is now paid a living wage. And I think that's just an absolutely crucial first step, because we believe that the minimum wage should be a living wage. If you work full-time, you should earn enough money to live on. It's a basic, decent principle. But until we're running things in Westminster, we can't make the minimum wage a living wage, although the campaign is really getting some traction. Where we're running a council, or where we've got influence on a council, we can really start to insist that that's a living wage council. And one of the really important things, and where this can really start to make a difference, is not just insisting that all of the council staff are paid a living wage, but that all of the contractors, the people working under the contractors, are paid a living wage too. Now, that's really critically important, because one of the great excuses for outsourcing and privatisation that we've seen in recent years is, oh, we've got to do it because it's cheaper. Now, we know very often it doesn't actually turn out to be cheaper, but what it does turn out is that the staff's wage and conditions get absolutely slashed. And if we insist that every contract, all of the staff are paid a living wage under it, then suddenly the arguments for keeping things in-house, or indeed even bringing them back in-house, start to become much clearer and much easier to make and much harder to refute. And up and down the country, we've seen libraries closing all over the place. Absolutely critical institutions, particularly for some of the poorest and most disadvantaged. At some of the worst, the library is a warm place. And you can go into lots of libraries and you'll see, particularly when it's very cold, lots of pensioners who are there because if they're there in the library, they're warm and they're not having to pay some extra on their home heating. We're seeing with the dreadful bedroom tax, the people who are actually able to move are going to be living in even more and more overcrowded housing. Indeed, 2 children of the same sex have to share a bedroom. And just imagine the situation, the 15-year-old doing their GCSEs, trying to do their homework, with the 7-year-old shares the room, rampaging around. And think of how that child is disadvantaged against the middle-class child with their own bedroom and their own space and a nice quiet space and computers and everything. You take away the libraries, and you're taking away the space where that child can go and work in reasonable quiet, has access to a computer, Wi-Fi, and all the rest of it. If you take away libraries, you're really taking away an essential resource. So in Brighton and Hove, they haven't closed any branch libraries. And that's been really tough and really hard to arrange, but they've regarded that as an absolute principle. And I think that's a really important one, which is it's becoming a 20 mile per hour area. All of the central areas are going to be 20 mile per hour in Brighton. And you know, the basic formula is really simple. There should be a 20 mile per hour limit everywhere that people live, work and shop on the road. In some places it's, we're fighting to get a 20 mile per hour zone outside the school, which seems pretty basic and pretty obvious really, but in some places that's still where they're at. Then you go to, we're fighting to get 20 mile per hour zones in residential areas. And then the real step along the way is 20 mile per hour zones everywhere where people live, work and shop. And the fact of the matter is that that only adds 90 seconds to the average person's journey. 90 seconds is not very much. But if you're hit by a car as a pedestrian or a cyclist, basically if you're hit by a car at 30 mile an hour, you will die. If you're hit by a car at 20 mile an hour, you will live. Obviously there's the odd general exception, but as a rule of thumb, that's the difference. But of course it's much more than the issue of just road safety, and there were 1,901 road deaths in Britain's roads last year, and that went up for the first year in a couple of decades that the figure has gone up, and that's absolutely the wrong direction. But it's much more than that, because 20 mile per hour also means perhaps the frail old lady who'd like to go and visit her friend, but feels like the street is so frightening and such a hostile space that she doesn't want to go and cross the road, and what that does to her quality of life. Or the mother with a couple of young children, a stroller and a couple of children that are just out of the stroller, getting across the road is a major expedition. So 20 mile per hour can make a real difference. And the person who's starting to think about cycling and thinking, getting on a bit, putting the pounds on a bit, maybe I should get a bit of exercise. But cycling, it feels a bit scary and there's all that traffic. There's a real step there of saying, well, the roads, the pace isn't too high. My difference between my speed and the car speed won't be that great. 20 mile per hour can really make a difference. So that's what they've done in Brighton and Hove. They've maintained the eligibility criteria for social care. Now, in many parts of the country, what's happened is the eligibility for that kind of social care has been sliced down and down. So you've got to be in the absolute most acute need. Basically unable to get out of the bed in the morning, unable to bath yourself before you can get social care. All of those intermediate steps, people have just lost the funded social care. They've either got to pay for it or go without. Now, maintaining the eligibility means that people stay in their own homes, they have contact with the outside world, they've got a clean house. It's really essential that we provide for what we call the low and the medium level needs, not just the acute needs. Because one of the things we're going to see otherwise, of course, is that lots of people will end up at acute when they never would have, or will end up at acute a lot faster if they don't have that lower level of care when they need it. So Brighton has maintained that eligibility when so many people haven't. And finally, I could go on, but I won't do too much on Brighton and Hove, but one thing that's just happened just last week, it's Bioregional, which is a very major NGO, has declared Brighton and Hove to be the first city in the world to be on the path to one planet living. It's the world's first officially declared one planet living city. It's on the path to it. We're living in Britain as though we have 3 planets and we have to cut it down to 1. And that covers a whole range of things, in terms of carbon emissions, of soil erosion, even the quality of air and air pollution. You try to squeeze all of that into one thing, and 3 planets to 1 planet is kind of a shorthand way of getting to all of that. But the fact that Brighton and Hove is actually, has won the official independent designation of the world's first one planet living city is something we really do need to trumpet around and celebrate. one place where we run things, but you don't actually have to be running the council to really make a difference. So I'm just going to pick up a couple of examples from different parts of the country. And I've really got to start with Councillor Andrew Cooper in Kirklees. It's just amazing to see how much, just 2 councillors there, and they also run a parish council. And that parish is quite amazing actually, because it's a very natural Tory area on the outskirts of Kirklees, and they're doing an enormous amount, including a very nice 1,000 fruit tree project, which is pretty well what it says on the tin. In public land around this fairly small parish, they're planting 1,000 fruit trees. So this is how that I came to be on I think it was a January day on the Yorkshire moors, with the hail blowing horizontally, digging holes for apple trees. On a sort of bigger scale of things, you can actually visit the Primrose Hill Solar Village, which again is something that the name pretty well, it does what it says on the tin. It's social housing, and it is absolutely plastered with solar panels. Every conceivable surface that you could put a solar panel on has a solar panel on. It was built a couple of years ago, and the tenants all enjoy the fact that they get the power first, and you know, if they're using less power than is being fed in, their electricity meter goes backwards. And that's, you know, a huge positive in terms of our energy output, but it's also our carbon output, but it's also a huge positive for the people living there in terms of fuel poverty and their general state of being. But probably even much better than that is that Andrew has almost single-handedly got more than 50,000 houses in Kirklees fully insulated. Wow. Each household is saving about £250 a year on their energy bills. And you know, one of the things that I very often say to the government is, why is it that we currently have no government money going into home insulation? Yeah. It creates jobs, and long-lasting, stable jobs, because there's an awful lot of homes to insulate. It saves fuel poverty, gets pretty well every poor household you do it for out of fuel poverty, and it cuts carbon emissions. Why are we not spending any government money on insulation? But where we've got elected Green councillors where we can make a difference there in Kirklees, we've got 50,000 houses insulated. Move even further down the scale now to the London Borough of Islington. And we had, sadly only for 4 years, one Green councillor there, Katie Dawson. Now, Katie was lucky enough to be in a situation where she more or less had the balance of power. It was a bit more complicated than that, but I won't go into the detailed politics of it. But what she got is one of the first things in the country, and it's something when I go around talking about it, you just see people's eyes light up, which is fitting because it's called Bright Sparks. And it's a shop. And it's a shop where, when your toaster dies, or your kettle dies, or your table leg gets wonky, you can take that toaster, that kettle, that table, and they'll fix it. This is what used to happen all of the time. Yeah. That used to be what happened when something went wrong, you fixed it. And yet, when you think about it, in the past couple of decades, our whole attitudes to things have changed so much that, of course, what everyone does now is just chucks it in the bin, goes into the landfill, and someone goes and buy new, then just go and buy a new one. And so what we have there is the start of a whole restoration of a whole economic model of fixing things instead of throwing them out. And that's, you know, and it's working well, it's self-supporting, it's financially self-supporting, it's just won another big award, and it's, you know, it's a small step, but it's a step in the right direction. Let's think really big scale. Let's actually think green government. A green government in Westminster. I'm not going to say it's going to happen tomorrow or the next day or anything like that, but what would we want to achieve? And what we need to achieve basically is an entire reformation, an entire reconstruction of how our economy works. Because it's very clear that globalisation, the whole idea that Britain can specialise in banking, arms and pharmaceuticals and import everything else, is an utterly failed model, an utterly failed way of thinking about things. What we need to do is bring food production back to Britain, And I'm not talking autarky here. I'm not saying that we produce absolutely everything we eat or anything like that. But we can produce a lot of it here. It's not so long ago that towns and cities were surrounded by a ring of market gardens. And a lot of the vegetables in particular that fed that town or city came a few miles, food miles about as short as you can imagine, from those market gardens. And that's what we need to go back to. And in terms of fruit, at the moment, 7% of the fruit we eat is grown in Britain. Now, it used to be that, Kent was famous for its apple orchards. Surrey was famous for its pear orchards. Now, it might be depending on the town and the geography, you mightn't always have a ring of orchards around the town as well, but it doesn't have to be that far away. And we need to bring manufacturing back to Britain. The idea that, I'll pretty well bet most of the chairs, all the chairs we're sitting on, most of the furniture in your home, unless you've tried very hard to buy local, it will have been made on the other side of the world. Unless you've tried very, very hard, most of the clothing you're wearing will have been made on the other side of the world. And the classic model is the cotton is grown in Azerbaijan, picked by a 10-year-old who should have been in school but was forced out in the fields instead, shipped over to China to be spun into yarn, shipped down to Sri Lanka, or indeed, as we've just seen, most tragically, over to Bangladesh, and sewn into a t-shirt, and then shipped on to our nearest high street. And, there you've bought the £5 t-shirt. And £5 really doesn't reflect the cost of that t-shirt. As we've seen very tragically in Bangladesh, the cost of that t-shirt is really far, far higher. And what we've got to do is change our economy so that we're making our clothing back in Britain again and paying people decently, not sweatshop wages, safe conditions, all of the rest of it. And we've got to make sure that has a fair chance to compete. So the other side of all of that, the food production, the manufacturing, is we need to also bring jobs back to Britain. And what we need to do is restore strong local economies. If you go and buy a pound of apples, that pound of apples that comes from New Zealand or South Africa or wherever it comes from, you go and buy it in Sainsbury's or Tesco or wherever, one of the big chain stores, maybe a couple of pence of your pound will stay here in Stroud. But basically, the rest of it whooshes off to company head office, quite likely very soon afterwards whooshes off to the nearest tax haven, and is never seen again. But if you buy that pound of apples, and ideally the locally grown pound of apples, from your local greengrocer, then she employs a local accountant. When she needs some new shelves, she employs a local builder. Maybe she's got some children and she employs a local childminder. And that pound you spend on the bag of apples goes round and round and creates jobs, creates a whole strong local economy. But in Lewis and in Bristol, where they've got local currencies, which is a great way of keeping money in the town going round and round. So we need to rebuild those local economies where the money goes round and round, creates all kind of different jobs, whether you're a builder or an accountant, whatever your kind of area is, you've got local jobs in the town. And so that's the kind of economy that a Green government would seek to rebuild. And we can do a lot of it, even at county kind of level. But if we start to think about what we need behind that, one of the key things is a different kind of finance system. We've just seen the co-op purchase of Lloyd's breakdown. Yeah. We have a few big financial institutions, and all the statistics show overwhelmingly they are not lending to small business. Small business cannot get finance, cannot operate without that finance. Now we need an entirely different sort of financial system. We need local credit unions, local mutuals, local banks that really understand the local area and can invest in that local area, invest in the small businesses. So we've got to have a different kind of financial system, and that's really one of the places we've got to start. And, Caroline was talking about the financial transaction tax. There was actually a leading article in the FT a couple of months ago which put it very well. Banks should be a utility. They should be like a gas or a water company. They provide the service, the flow of money, they store the money when you want them to store the money, and they just do that. It's like a basic, really boring service. And that's the kind of financial system that we need. So there I've tried to, in a very brief period of time, paint a picture of what a green government would try to achieve. We've got the vision. On most of those things, we've got the track record. What we've got to do, quite simply, is just elect all the people. Let's go to it. Thank you.